They called it the Schwalbe, the Swallow. And when Messerschmitt test pilot Fritz Wendel first throttled up the twin Junkers Umo 004 turbojets on that July morning in 1942, streaking across the Bavarian sky at speeds no human being had ever experienced in combat aviation, he knew with absolute certainty that he was piloting the future, not a future. The future. At 540 miles per hour, the sleek, swept wingjet screamed past every propeller-driven fighter the Allies could field as if they were standing still, because functionally they were. The Spitfire, the Mustang, the Thunderbolt, those legendary workhorses of Allied air supremacy, maxed out around 440 miles per hour in optimal conditions. The Schwalbe, the Messerschmitt Me 262, was 100 miles per hour faster, could climb like a rocket, and carried four 30mm Mk-108 cannons that could shred a B-17 Flying Fortress in a single 2-second burst. When Wendell landed and pulled off his flight helmet, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that Germany had just invented a weapon that could single-handedly reverse the entire strategic air war, the bomber streams, the daylight raids, the 1,000 plane formations that were systematically turning German cities into rubble and German industry into smoking craters. All of it could be stopped. All of it could be shattered. One Me-262 could do the work of 5 conventional fighters. A squadron of Me-262s could massacre an entire bomber group before the lumbering B-17s even knew what hit them. The Allied escorts, those proud Mustangs and Thunderbolts, would be left chasing ghosts. Too slow to catch the jets, too outgunned to fight them, reduced to helpless spectators as the Me-262s tore through the formations like wolves through a flock of sheep. The engineers knew it. The test pilots knew it. Luftwaffe. General Adolf Galland, Germany's most decorated fighter ace, flew the prototype himself in May 1943 and landed with tears in his eyes. Not from emotion, but from fury. From the desperate, clawing realization that the Luftwaffe finally had the weapon that could turn the tide. I urge immediate mass production. Immediately. Not tomorrow, not next month, now. But there was a problem. And the problem was not technical. It was not a question of resources or manufacturing capacity or engineering challenges. The problem was simple, human, and catastrophically stupid. The problem had a mustache, a deranged vision of military tactics formed in the trenches of World War I, and an unshakable, pathological belief in his own infallibility, despite possessing not a single day of formal military education beyond the rank of corporal. The problem was Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler had an idea. Let me be very clear about something before we go any further into this nightmare of totalitarian incompetence. The Me-262 was not just a good aircraft. It was not merely an incremental improvement over existing technology. It was a generational leap. It was the difference between a musket and a machine gun. The Me-262 represented a fundamental shift in the physics of aerial combat. A shift so profound that every single air force in the world would spend the next decade desperately trying to replicate what Messerschmitt had achieved in 1942. The Americans would eventually field the P-80 Shooting Star. The British would develop the Gloucester Meteor. The Soviets would rip off German designs wholesale and produce the MiG-9. But in 1943, in 1944, when it mattered, when the air war over Europe was reaching its apocalyptic crescendo, when American B-17s and B-24s were flying round-the-clock missions to obliterate German infrastructure, only Germany had an operational jet fighter. Only Germany had the weapon that could stop the bleeding. Let me give you some perspective on what the Me-262 could have accomplished if deployed correctly. In the final months of the war, when a tiny number of Me-262s were finally, belatedly, grudgingly allowed to operate as fighters, they achieved a kill ratio that made every other aircraft in the Luftwaffe look like a child's toy. Pilots flying the Me-262 in fighter configuration racked up kill rates of 20-1, sometimes higher. 20 Allied aircraft destroyed for every Me-262 lost. One pilot, Heinrich Erler, shot down 9 Allied planes in a single month flying the jet. Another, Kurt Welter, claimed 25 night kills. The Me-262 equipped Jagdwehrband 44, commanded by Galland himself after he was essentially fired for repeatedly telling Hitler he was an idiot, became the most lethal fighter unit in the Luftwaffe despite having fewer than 50 aircraft. The numbers were staggering. The potential was limitless. If Germany had fielded $500 Me-262s as pure interceptors in early 1944, the Allied bombing campaign would have ground to a halt. If they had fielded 1,000, it would have been a slaughter. The 8th Air Force would have been bled white. The strategic air offensive that crippled German oil production, destroyed German transportation networks, and paved the way for D-Day would have been stopped cold. But they did not field 500 Me-262s as interceptors in early 1944. They did not field 1,000. They barely fielded any at all, because Adolf Hitler, the man who thought he understood military tactics better than his generals, the man who overruled his staff at every turn, the man who made strategic decisions based on intuition, ideology, and an unshakable faith in his own brilliance despite a track record of consistent, catastrophic failure, took one look at the Me-262 and decided it should be a bomber. Not a fighter, a bomber. A fast bomber. A blitz bomber. Because in Hitler's mind, in that fevered, deteriorating brain that was slowly succumbing to Parkinson's disease, amphetamine addiction, and the psychological weight of watching his thousand-year Reich collapse in real time, the only thing that mattered was attack, offense, aggression, striking back, revenge. He had watched the Allies land at Normandy. He had watched German cities burn under British night raids and American daylight raids. He had watched the Eastern Front collapse as Soviet armies steamrolled through Poland. And his response, his solution, his grand strategic vision, was that Germany needed to hit back. Germany needed to bomb the Allied invasion beaches. Germany needed to strike terror into the hearts of the enemy with fast, unstoppable bombers that could scream over the English Channel, drop their payloads, and vanish before the defenders could react. Never mind that Germany did not have air superiority. Never mind that German cities were being systematically destroyed because the Luftwaffe could not stop the Allied bomber streams. Never mind that every single competent military advisor, every experienced pilot, every engineer who understood the aircraft was screaming that the Me-262's value lay in its ability to intercept bombers, not to become one. Hitler knew better. Hitler always knew better. And so, in May of 1943, when Hitler first saw the Me-262 at a demonstration at Insterburg, he asked one question. Just one. Can this aircraft carry bombs? The Messerschmitt representatives, confused, explained that yes, technically the Me-262 could be adapted to carry bombs, but that was not its purpose. Its purpose was air superiority. Its purpose was to kill Allied bombers. Its purpose was to defend the Reich. Hitler stared at them with those cold, dead eyes and repeated the question, "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" And when they said yes, he smiled. And that smile doomed Germany. Here is where the story transitions from mere strategic incompetence to genuine, surreal, almost comedic tragedy. Except nothing about it is funny because thousands of people died as a result. Hitler became obsessed, completely, pathologically obsessed with the idea of the Me-262 as a bomber. He started calling it the Blitz bomber in every meeting, every conference, every planning session. He issued direct orders that the Me-262 was to be developed exclusively as a fast bomber. He demanded that bomb racks be fitted to the aircraft immediately. He wanted 1,000-kilogram bomb loads. He wanted dive bombing capabilities. He wanted terror weapons. He wanted vengeance. And when his generals, his staff, his advisors, when Galland and Göring and every competent person in the Luftwaffe chain of command tried to explain, patiently, desperately, that this was insane, that the Me-262 was needed as a fighter, that German cities were burning, that the bomber streams were the existential threat, that converting a revolutionary interceptor into a mediocre light bomber was tantamount to melting down a sword to make a butter knife, Hitler exploded. He screamed at them. He accused them of defeatism. He threatened them with courts martial. He invoked his authority as Führer, as Supreme Commander. as the visionary leader who had led Germany from the ashes of Weimar to the heights of European dominance. How dare they question him? How dare they suggest that he, Adolf Hitler, who had orchestrated the conquest of France, who had masterminded the Blitzkrieg, who had humbled the British Empire, did not understand aerial warfare. The Me-262 would be a bomber. That was an order. And in Nazi Germany, orders from Hitler were not suggestions. They were law, immutable, absolute, enforced by terror. So the engineers went back to their drawing boards and started redesigning the Me-262 to carry bombs. And every day they spent adding bomb racks was a day not spent mass-producing fighters. Every modification to the airframe for ground attack capability was a modification that weakened its interceptor performance. Every hour wasted on Hitler's deranged vision was an hour that Allied bombers flew unmolested over German cities. The delay was catastrophic. The Me-262 should have entered mass production in late 1943. It should have been operational by early 1944, long before D-Day, in numbers sufficient to make a strategic difference. Instead, production was halted, restarted, modified, redesigned, and delayed over and over again as Hitler kept changing his demands, kept insisting on bomber variants, kept vetoing any suggestion that the aircraft be used as a fighter. Galland, desperate, began a quiet campaign of bureaucratic resistance, trying to sneak fighter versions of the Me-262 into production under the guise of bomber prototypes. He was not alone. Lower-level Luftwaffe officers, engineers, test pilots, they all knew what was happening. They all watched in horror as the one weapon that could save Germany was systematically sabotaged by the one man who claimed to be saving it. And now I want to pause here, about a third of the way through this story, and ask you something. Because this is not just a story about World War II. This is not just a story about airplanes and tactical decisions. This is a story about a pattern that repeats throughout human history, over and over again, in every era, every civilization, every institution. The pattern of expertise crushed by authority. The pattern of people who actually know what they are talking about being overruled by people who do not, but who have power. The pattern of catastrophic decisions made by leaders who are so convinced of their own brilliance that they cannot see their own incompetence. So here is my question for you, and I want you to comment below with your answer. Do you think history is shaped more by brilliant people making brilliant decisions, or by stubborn, arrogant people making terrible decisions and having the power to enforce them? In your experience, in your observation of the world, does the Dunning-Kruger effect, that psychological phenomenon where the least competent people are the most confident in their abilities, does that effect run entire nations? Because as we continue with this story, as we watch Hitler systematically destroy Germany's best chance at air superiority through sheer egotistical delusion, I want you to think about how many times this same story has played out in different contexts. How many times has someone with just enough knowledge to be dangerous, but not enough to be competent, seized control and driven everything into the ground while the experts watched helplessly? Comment below. Tell me what you think. Because understanding this pattern, recognizing it, calling it out, that might be the only way we ever break it. Let us return to 1944. D-Day is coming. The Allied invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, is being planned down to the last detail, and German intelligence knows it is coming. They do not know exactly where, they do not know exactly when, but they know the Allies are going to land somewhere on the French coast and launch the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And Hitler, fixated on his Blitz bomber fantasy, is convinced that when the invasion comes, his Me-262s will swoop down on the beaches, bomb the landing craft, strafe the soldiers, and turn the invasion into a massacre. He has told his generals this repeatedly. He has staked German defensive strategy on this belief. The Me-262 Blitz bomber will save Normandy. The problem, and there are so many problems at this point that they are starting to stack on top of each other like a Jenga tower designed by a sadist, is that by mid-1944, Germany has produced only a handful of Me-262s, and the ones that exist are scattered across various test units, training squadrons, and experimental groups. There is no mass production, there is no operational doctrine, there is no cohesive strategy. There are just a few dozen jets, some configured as fighters, some configured as bombers, most of them grounded due to engine problems or lack of fuel or lack of trained pilots, and all of them caught in the middle of a bureaucratic nightmare as Hitler keeps issuing contradictory orders about how they should be used. Galland is tearing his hair out. He has been advocating for a concentrated force of Me-262 fighters to defend German cities from bomber raids, a strategy so obvious, so logical, so desperately needed that its rejection borders on the absurd. But Hitler will not hear it. In a meeting in November 1943, Hitler directly asked Galland, "Can the Me-262 carry bombs?" And Galland, who had learned by this point that honesty with Hitler was a quick path to dismissal or worse, tried to dodge the question. He said the aircraft was designed as a fighter. Hitler asked again, "Can it carry bombs? Yes or no?" Galland admitted that yes, technically it could carry bombs, but only at the expense of performance, fuel capacity, and combat effectiveness. Hitler interrupted him. "Then it will carry bombs. I want every Me-262 configured as a blitz bomber. No exceptions. Anyone who questions this order will be removed from their post." And that was that. The Führer had spoken. The die was cast. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied troops land on the beaches of Normandy. The skies over the invasion fleet are dominated by Allied aircraft. Thousands of them. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, transport aircraft, a swarm of Allied air power so overwhelming that German ground forces can barely move during daylight hours without being strafed into oblivion. And where are the Me-262 blitz bombers? Where is Hitler's miracle weapon? Where are the jets that are supposed to turn the tide? They are nowhere. A few, maybe 2 or 3, attempt ground attack missions in the weeks following the invasion. They drop their bombs, most of which miss their targets because the Me-262 was never designed for precision bombing and has no bomb site worth mentioning. They strafe a few vehicles. They achieve absolutely nothing of strategic value. And then they fly home, if they make it home at all, having burned through their fuel for missions that a conventional bomber or ground attack aircraft could have done just as poorly and at a fraction of the cost. Meanwhile, over Germany, the American 8th Air Force is flying missions with impunity. Bomber streams, hundreds of aircraft at a time, are obliterating German oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, transportation hubs, everything that keeps a modern war machine functioning. The Luftwaffe, starved of resources, starved of fuel, starved of pilots, is being systematically destroyed in a war of attrition it cannot win. And the one weapon that could have changed the calculus, the one weapon that could have made the Allies pay an unacceptable price for their bombing campaign, is being wasted on pointless ground attack missions that accomplish nothing. The frustration among Luftwaffe pilots and commanders reaches a breaking point. In January 1945, Galland is essentially fired from his position as general of the fighter arm after one too many arguments with Goering about the Me-262. But Galland, stubborn and brilliant, refuses to fade away quietly. He convinces the High Command to let him form an elite Me-262 fighter unit, Jagdwehrband 44, staffed entirely by veteran aces, to demonstrate once and for all what the jet can do in the hands of skilled pilots operating in its intended role. JV-44 becomes operational in March 1945. It is too late. The war is already lost. Berlin is about to fall. The Red Army is closing in from the east. The Western Allies are driving into Germany from the west. But for a few brief, glorious, tragic weeks, JV-44 shows the world what could have been. Flying from improvised airstrips, scrounging fuel from abandoned depots, operating with minimal support, Galland's pilots tear into Allied bomber formations with ruthless efficiency. They shoot down dozens of bombers. They lose almost no aircraft in air-to-air combat. Most of their losses come from Allied fighters catching them during takeoff or landing, or from mechanical failures, or from running out of fuel. The kill ratios are incredible. The tactical effectiveness is undeniable. And it means nothing, because by March 1945, Germany is finished. There is no oil, there is no infrastructure, there is no coherent defense. A few dozen Me-262s, no matter how effective, cannot stop the collapse of an entire nation. Let us talk about the technical brilliance that was wasted, because it is important to understand just how revolutionary the Me-262 actually was. The aircraft was not just fast, it was a complete rethinking of fighter design. The engines, the Junkers Jumo 04 turbojets, were the first mass-produced jet engines in history. They were crude by modern standards, with a service life of only about 25 hours before they needed to be replaced, but they worked. They produced 1,980 pounds of thrust each, enough to push the Me-262 to speeds that made it functionally untouchable by propeller-driven aircraft. The airframe was aerodynamically advanced, with swept wings to delay the onset of compressibility effects at high speed, a design feature that would become standard on every jet fighter that followed. The weapon's loadout was devastating. 4 Mk-108 autocannons, 30mm monsters that fired explosive shells capable of ripping apart heavy bombers. A single hit from an Mk-108 could cripple a B-17. A 2-second burst could destroy it outright. Allied pilots who encountered the Me-262 in combat described it as terrifying. It would appear out of nowhere, a gray streak moving faster than anything they had ever seen, rip through a bomber formation in seconds, and vanish before the escorts could react. Conventional defensive tactics. The things that worked against German piston-engine fighters like the Bf-109 or Fw-190 were useless against the Me-262. You could not outrun it. You could not outclimb it. You could not outturn it in the vertical. The only way to kill an Me-262 was to catch it when it was vulnerable, during takeoff or landing, when it was slow and low and committed to a predictable flight path. Allied commanders quickly realized this and started assigning entire fighter squadrons to patrol known Me-262 airfields, waiting for the jets to appear. It worked, but it was a resource-intensive tactic, and it highlighted just how dangerous the Me-262 was. The Allies had to dedicate significant assets just to counter a weapon that Germany fielded in pathetically small numbers. Imagine if Germany had 500 262s operating as pure fighters in 1944. And imagine if they had 1,000. The Allies would have been forced to completely rethink their strategic bombing campaign. They might have been forced to abandon daylight raids altogether. They might have been forced to accept attrition rates so high that the political cost became unbearable. The war would not have been won by Germany. The material and manpower advantage of the Allies was too overwhelming, but it could have been prolonged by years. The cost in lives, both military and civilian, would have been staggering. And all of that potential was squandered because one man, one deeply incompetent man with absolute power, decided he knew better than everyone else. Let us talk about why Hitler made this decision, because understanding the psychology behind it is crucial to understanding how disasters like this happen. Hitler was not stupid. Let me be very clear about that. He was evil. He was delusional. He was increasingly mentally unstable due to a combination of stress, illness, and drug abuse, but he was not unintelligent. He had a certain low cunning, a talent for political manipulation, and a decent understanding of propaganda and mass psychology. But he was also a classic example of someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. He had served in World War I as an infantryman, a corporal, a messenger. He had experienced trench warfare. He had seen the horrors of the Western Front. And from that limited experience, he had extrapolated an entire philosophy of warfare that was fundamentally rooted in offense, aggression, willpower, and morale. In Hitler's worldview, wars were won by attacking, by seizing the initiative, by striking fear into the enemy. Defense was weakness. Defense was defeatism. Defense was giving up. And this philosophy, this deeply flawed, outdated, tactically illiterate philosophy, infected every military decision he made. When his generals told him that the Me-262 should be used as a defensive interceptor, what Hitler heard was surrender. He heard defeatism. He heard weakness. Because interceptors are defensive weapons. Interceptors react. Interceptors wait for the enemy to come to you. And Hitler's entire psychological framework could not tolerate that. He needed to attack. He needed to strike back. He needed to show the German people and himself that Germany was still on the offensive, still strong, still capable of hitting the enemy. The Blitz bomber was not a tactical decision. It was a psychological compulsion. It was Hitler's attempt to impose his will on reality, to force the war to conform to his ideology rather than adapting his strategy to the actual situation. And this is the core of the Dunning-Kruger effect in action. Hitler genuinely believed he understood aerial warfare better than his generals, because he had commanded armies at a strategic level. He believed his intuition, his instincts, his ideological purity made him a better judge of military tactics than professionals who had spent their entire careers studying the subject. He could not see his own incompetence because his ego, his narcissism, his totalitarian power insulated him from feedback. No one could tell him he was wrong. No one could force him to confront his failures, and so he kept making the same mistakes over and over again, escalating his commitment to failed strategies, doubling down on bad decisions, driving Germany deeper into catastrophe while blaming everyone else for the results. There is a specific meeting that encapsulates the entire tragedy of the Me-262 saga, and it happened in May 1944, just weeks before D-Day. Erhard Milch, one of the Luftwaffe's most competent logistical officers, was giving a presentation on jet fighter production. He explained to Hitler that the Me-262 was ready for mass production, that factories were prepared, that pilot training was underway, and that the aircraft could be operational as a fighter interceptor within months. Milch presented data, production schedules, projected deployment numbers. He made the case, clearly and logically, that the Me-262 could turn the air war around if deployed correctly. Hitler listened in silence. When Milch finished, Hitler asked one question: "How many bombs can it carry?" Milch, exasperated, explained again that the Me-262 was a fighter, not a bomber, and that converting it to a bomber role would delay production, reduce effectiveness, and waste the aircraft's potential. Hitler stood up. He pointed at Milch. He said, "I did not ask for your opinion. I asked how many bombs it can carry." Milch said 2 500-kilogram bombs, maybe. Hitler smiled. "Then it is a Blitz bomber. Proceed with production as a Blitz bomber." Meeting adjourned. That was it. That was the decision-making process. No debate. No consideration of alternatives. No analysis of costs and benefits. Just ego, ideology, and authoritarianism. And the horrifying thing, the truly nightmarish thing, is that this was not unique to Hitler or Nazi Germany. This pattern, this dynamic of incompetent leadership overruling competent expertise, plays out constantly throughout history. It is playing out right now, today, in governments, corporations, institutions all over the world. People with power but without knowledge making decisions that people with knowledge but without power have to implement, and then watching in horror as everything falls apart. The Me-262 is not just a story about World War II. It is a story about what happens when authority and competence become decoupled, when the people making decisions are not the people who understand the consequences. By the summer of 1944, the situation had become farcical. The Luftwaffe was operating a bizarre mix of Me-262 variants, some configured as fighters, some configured as bombers, some configured as reconnaissance aircraft, none of them available in sufficient numbers to make a strategic impact in any role. Hitler was still issuing orders about the Blitz bomber, but by this point, even the Nazi propaganda machine could not hide the reality that Germany was losing the air war. Cities were burning. Factories were rubble. Transportation networks were destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign was achieving its objectives, slowly, methodically, grinding Germany into dust. And the weapon that could have stopped it, or at least slowed it, was scattered across airfields, hangars, and production facilities, waiting for a coherent strategy that would never come. There is a particularly bitter irony in the fact that Hitler, obsessed with using the Me-262 to attack the Allied invasion, never actually witnessed the aircraft being used effectively in that role, because it was not used effectively in that role. It could not be. The Me-262 was a brilliant interceptor forced to operate as a mediocre ground attack aircraft. It was a scalpel being used as a hammer, and everyone involved except Hitler understood this. The pilots knew it. The engineers knew it. The field commanders knew it. But knowledge without power is useless, and in Nazi Germany, power without knowledge was the norm. Galland later wrote in his memoirs that the Me-262 controversy was the moment he realized Germany had already lost the war, not because of material shortages or Allied superiority, but because the German leadership had become so detached from reality, so consumed by ideology and ego that they could no longer make rational decisions. He wrote that watching Hitler squander the Me-262 was like watching a man drown, while refusing to grab the life preserver because he insisted he could swim even though he clearly could not. It was surreal. It was maddening. It was utterly, completely avoidable. Let me give you some numbers to illustrate just how catastrophic Hitler's decision was. By the end of the war, Germany had produced approximately 1,440 262s. That sounds like a lot, but consider that production did not ramp up until mid-1944, and that hundreds of those aircraft never saw combat due to lack of fuel, lack of trained pilots, or mechanical issues. Of the Me-262s that did see combat, only a fraction were used as fighters. The rest were wasted on ground attack missions, reconnaissance, or experimental roles. Now consider what could have happened if Germany had committed to mass production of the Me-262 as a pure fighter in early 1943, when the design was mature and ready. By the end of 1943, Germany could have had 500 operational Me-262 fighters. By mid-1944, that number could have been 2,000 or more. The impact on the air war would have been revolutionary. Let us do some math. The Me-262 had a kill ratio of roughly 20 to 1 in the hands of experienced pilots. Even if we assume a more conservative ratio of 10 to 1 to account for less experienced pilots and mechanical failures, 500 Tihau and Me-262s operating as interceptors could theoretically shoot down 5,000 Allied aircraft before being destroyed themselves. The 8th Air Force, at its peak, had about 2,000 heavy bombers operational at any given time. Losses of that magnitude would have been unsustainable. The bombing campaign would have been suspended, reorganized, or scaled back dramatically. Allied air superiority, the foundation of every Allied offensive from D-Day onward, would have been contested. The war would not have been won by Germany, but it would have been prolonged, and the cost in lives would have been immense, and all of that hinged on one decision, made by one man, who refused to listen to anyone who disagreed with him. That is the scale of the disaster we are talking about. That is how much damage one incompetent leader can do when surrounded by yes men and armed with absolute authority. There is a postscript to this story that is worth mentioning because it highlights how thoroughly Hitler's obsession with the Blitz bomber poisoned German strategic thinking. In late 1944, as the war situation deteriorated further, Hitler became briefly enthusiastic about using the Me-262 as a night fighter to counter British bombing raids. This was, ironically, a reasonable idea. The Me-262 had the speed and firepower to be effective in that role. But by this point, resources were so scarce, training was so limited, and the Luftwaffe was so disorganized that almost nothing came of it. A few Me-262s were equipped with radar and used for night interception, and they were reasonably effective, but there were too few of them, too late to make any difference. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Me-262 program, which could have been a war-winning weapon if deployed correctly, ended as a footnote, a historical curiosity, a symbol of wasted potential. After the war, the Allies captured hundreds of Me-262s and extensively studied them. American engineers were stunned by the sophistication of the design. The Me-262 directly influenced the development of American jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre, which would go on to dominate the skies over Korea. The Soviets reverse-engineered captured Me-262s and used the technology to jumpstart their own jet programs. The British incorporated lessons from the Me-262 into their own designs. The entire world of post-war aviation was shaped by Messerschmitt's creation. But for Germany, in the moment when it mattered, the Me-262 was nothing more than a tragic what-if, a glimpse of a future that never arrived because one man's ego stood in the way. And this brings us to the central lesson of this story, the reason why it matters, the reason why we need to remember it and talk about it and refuse to let it fade into the background noise of history. The Me-262 disaster was not caused by lack of resources. It was not caused by technological limitations. It was not caused by Allied superiority. It was caused by one person in a position of power making a series of catastrophically bad decisions and having the authority to enforce those decisions despite unanimous opposition from people who actually understood the subject. That is the lesson. That is the pattern. And that pattern repeats. It repeats in governments, where politicians with no understanding of science make policy about climate change or public health. It repeats in corporations, where executives with no technical knowledge make decisions about product development or engineering priorities. It repeats in institutions, where administrators with no field experience override the judgment of practitioners. The Me-262 story is not unique, it is universal. It is the story of expertise ignored, authority unquestioned, and disaster inevitable. And until we, as a society, as a civilization, figure out how to build systems where competence is valued over confidence, where knowledge is prioritized over power, where leaders are chosen based on their ability to listen and learn rather than their ability to command and control, we are going to keep repeating this mistake over and over and over again. The names will change. The technology will change. The specifics will change. But the fundamental dynamic, the dance of incompetence and authority, will remain the same. So here is what I want you to do. If you found this story valuable, if it made you think, if it helped you understand something about how power and knowledge interact and why that matters, I want you to subscribe to this channel, because this is what we do here. We dig into the human folly behind historical disasters. We expose the recurring patterns of ego, ideology, and incompetence that drive nations, institutions, and individuals into catastrophe. We tell the stories that need to be told, the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about leadership and decision-making, and the consequences of unchecked authority. This is not just history for history's sake. This is history as a warning. This is history as a mirror. This is history as a guide to recognizing the same mistakes when they happen again, because they will happen again. They are happening right now, and the only way to stop them is to see them clearly, call them out loudly, and refuse to let them be normalized. So subscribe, share this video, leave a comment, engage with this content. Because if we forget the lessons of the Me-262, if we forget what happens when expertise is silenced and authority is absolute, we will be condemned to watch the same tragedy play out again and again, in different forms, with different names, but with the same preventable, infuriating, heartbreaking results. Now let us return one final time to the engineers and pilots who watched this disaster unfold in real time, because their perspective is crucial. These were not stupid people. These were not cowards. These were skilled professionals, many of them brilliant, who dedicated their lives to their craft and found themselves trapped in a system where excellence was punished and obedience was rewarded. Messerschmitt's design team had created something extraordinary, a genuine leap forward in aviation technology, and they were forced to watch it be misused, wasted, and ultimately squandered. The test pilots, men like Fritz Wendel and Gerd Lindner, flew the Me-262 and understood its potential better than anyone, and they were powerless to stop the bureaucratic insanity that surrounded the program. The Luftwaffe aces, pilots like Galland and Steinhoff and Barkhorn, Men who had risked their lives daily in aerial combat and knew exactly what was needed to defend Germany from the bomber streams, were ignored, dismissed, and in some cases threatened with courts-martial for speaking the truth. They were all hostages to one man's delusion, and the tragedy is that they knew it. They saw it happening. They tried to stop it, and they failed. Not because they were wrong, but because they lacked the power to enforce their correctness. In a totalitarian system, truth is not enough. Knowledge is not enough. Expertise is not enough. The only thing that matters is power, and in Nazi Germany, all power flowed from Hitler. His word was law. His decisions were final, and his competence, or lack thereof, was irrelevant to his authority. This is the ultimate lesson of the Me 262. Competence without authority is impotent. Authority without competence is catastrophic. And when you build a system where authority is absolute and competence is optional, you are building a system designed to fail in the most spectacular and destructive way possible. Let us imagine, for a moment, a counterfactual. Imagine that in early 1943, when the Me 262 was first demonstrated to the High Command, Hitler had listened to his advisors. Imagine that he had taken Gallen's advice, recognized the strategic value of the jet as a fighter, and ordered immediate mass production for air defense. Imagine that by the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe had 200 operational Me 262s defending German cities. By the end of 1943, 500. By D-Day, 1,000. The Allied bombing campaign would have become untenable. The loss rates would have been catastrophic. American and British planners would have been forced to reconsider their entire strategic approach. Daylight bombing raids, the backbone of the combined bomber offensive, might have been abandoned altogether. The timetable for D-Day might have been delayed. The course of the war would have been altered. Not enough to change the final outcome, because by 1943 the material imbalance between the Allies and Germany was too overwhelming, but enough to prolong the conflict, enough to increase the death toll, enough to change the specific trajectory of how the war ended. And all of that hinged on one decision, one moment, one man choosing to listen instead of dictate. But he did not, and so history unfolded the way it did. The Me 262 was squandered. Germany lost the air war. The cities burned. The factories were destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded. D-Day succeeded. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany utterly defeated. And the Me 262, the weapon that could have changed everything, became a symbol not of German technological prowess, but of German leadership incompetence. It became a testament to the fact that in war, in politics, in any human endeavor, it does not matter how good your tools are if the people using them are incompetent. It does not matter how brilliant your engineers are if your leadership is delusional. It does not matter how much potential you have if the person in charge refuses to let you use it. The post-war analysis of the Me 262 program is almost painful to read because everyone, from American intelligence officers to British historians to German veterans, agrees on what went wrong. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that the Me 262, if deployed in large numbers as a fighter in 1943 or early 1944, could have severely disrupted Allied bombing operations. British Air Ministry reports reached the same conclusion. German veterans, interviewed decades later, were unanimous in their assessment that Hitler's interference with the Me 262 program was one of the most consequential strategic blunders of the entire war. Galland, in his post-war writings, was blunt to the point of bitterness. He wrote that the Me 262 fiasco was proof that Nazi Germany had become a fundamentally irrational state, where ideology trumped reality, where loyalty mattered more than competence, and where the dictator's whims carried more weight than objective analysis. He described the experience of trying to advocate for rational deployment of the Me 262 as surreal, like living in an alternate reality where facts did not matter and arguments were decided by who had more political power rather than who was actually correct. Other Luftwaffe officers echoed his sentiments. Johannes Steinhoff, Another ace who flew the Me-262 near the end of the war wrote that the entire experience was a microcosm of why Germany lost. It was not about resources or manpower or technology. It was about leadership. It was about the systematic elevation of incompetence, the suppression of dissent, and the catastrophic consequences of surrounding a dictator with yes men who refused to tell him the truth. Nazi Germany had the talent. It had the engineers, the scientists, the pilots, the soldiers. What it lacked was a leadership structure capable of using that talent effectively. And that lack, more than any material shortage, more than any tactical defeat, was what doomed the Third Reich. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this story. The thing that makes it relevant today, right now, in the present. The dynamics that destroyed the Me-262 program have not gone away. They are still here. They are still active. They are still ruining projects, destroying organizations, and causing disasters. The pattern of incompetent leadership overruling competent expertise is not some relic of totalitarian regimes. It is a constant feature of human organizations. It happens in democracies. It happens in corporations. It happens in universities, hospitals, government agencies, tech companies, everywhere that power and knowledge intersect. How many times have you watched a manager with no technical expertise override the advice of engineers who actually build the product? How many times have you seen a politician with no scientific training make policy decisions that contradict the consensus of experts? How many times have you experienced a leader who is so convinced of their own brilliance that they cannot hear feedback, cannot acknowledge mistakes, cannot adapt to new information? The Me-262 is not ancient history. It is a playbook. It is a warning. It is a pattern that we need to recognize and resist every single time it appears. Because the cost of ignoring it is not just organizational dysfunction or wasted resources. The cost is measured in lives lost, opportunities squandered, and potential destroyed. The cost is everything that could have been but was not. Because someone with power but without wisdom decided they knew better. And so we come to the end of this story, back to where we started, with the test pilots and engineers who held the future in their hands and watched it slip away. Fritz Wendel, who first flew the Me-262 and knew instantly that it was revolutionary, survived the war and lived until 1975. In interviews later in life, he spoke about the Me-262 with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in what the engineering team had accomplished, sadness at what could have been. He said that flying the Me-262 was the pinnacle of his career as a test pilot, and watching it be misused was the most frustrating experience of his professional life. He compared it to building a masterpiece and then watching someone use it as firewood. Willy Messerschmitt himself, the designer, was more circumspect, but even he acknowledged in post-war statements that the political interference with the Me-262 program had been damaging. He stopped short of directly criticizing Hitler out of either residual loyalty or fear of association with the Nazi regime, but he made it clear that the aircraft had been deployed incorrectly and that the delays in production had been unnecessary and costly. Galland, as mentioned, was the most vocal, and his writings are essential reading for anyone interested in the history of the Luftwaffe or the broader question of how organizations make catastrophically bad decisions. He did not mince words. He laid the blame directly at Hitler's feet and made the case that the Me-262 disaster was emblematic of a leadership culture that valued obedience over competence and ideology over reality. These men, and hundreds of others involved in the Me-262 program, carried the knowledge of what had gone wrong for the rest of their lives. They knew that Germany had possessed a weapon that could have changed the course of the air war. They knew that it had been squandered. They knew who was responsible. And they knew that the lesson, the core lesson, the essential truth of the Me-262 disaster, was that competence divorced from authority is useless, and authority divorced from competence is lethal. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the warning. The Messerschmitt Me-262. Schwalbe, the Swallow, the jet fighter that could have turned the tide, destroyed by one man's ego, One man's delusion, one man's absolute refusal to listen to anyone who knew better. It is a tragedy. It is a cautionary tale. And it is, unfortunately, a story that will keep repeating until we learn to recognize the pattern and build systems that prioritize knowledge over power, competence over confidence, and truth over authority. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Comment below with your thoughts on the Dunning-Kruger effect in leadership. And remember, the only way to avoid repeating history is to understand it deeply, unflinchingly, and with a commitment to never letting the same mistakes happen again on our watch.